I'll bet $50 you quit within 7 days. These agency types never stick. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 11 minutes before the John Doe arrived who would change everything. The words hung in the ER morning air like humidity, spoken loud enough for the entire staff to hear during rounds, his tone the exact pitch of a man who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. Rachel Torres didn't look up from the trauma supply cart she was organizing. Her hands remained steady, fingers arranging sterile gauze packets in descending size order, a system nobody else at St. Michael's used because nobody else had learned it the way she had. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that particular register that made her teeth ache, a sound like electricity singing through copper wire. Caldwell turned to face her, waiting for the reaction he'd already scripted in his mind, a flush, maybe, or the quick defensive laugh of someone trying to salvage dignity. Rachel turned the cart slightly and began restocking the next shelf. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being ignored. The temp agency said you had nursing experience. That's generous. He laughed, the kind that invited others to join in. 2 of the morning shift nurses obliged, their voices thin and practiced. 7 days. I'm putting money on it. Who's in? Rachel's breathing didn't change. In, hold for 4 counts, out for 6. A technique she'd learned in a place with no name, in a situation that officially never happened. Her scrubs were pressed military sharp, creases running down her sleeves like blades. The other nurses wore theirs soft and lived in. That difference alone made her stand out. She'd learned long ago that invisibility wasn't about hiding. It was about being so precise, so competent, so utterly unremarkable in your execution that people looked through you. A ghost isn't invisible because of magic. A ghost is invisible because no one expects to see one. We've got standards here at St. Michael's. Caldwell was warming to his own voice now, the way bullies do when the audience seems to be theirs. Not everyone cuts it in a trauma center. Some people get overwhelmed. The blood, the chaos, the weight of it. He glanced at Rachel's profile. She didn't turn. Agency staff especially. They're transient. Unreliable. Here today, gone tomorrow. Just a paycheck to them. One of the nurses nodded. Rachel finished with the gauze and moved to the 4 starter kits, each one sealed in sterile packaging, arranged by gauge size, 22, 20, 18, 16, 14. She could do a central line blindfolded. She'd done worse than that in the dark. She'd done it while rounds were impacting the concrete wall behind her head. But that was classified. That was before the operation in Fallujah went sideways and the military decided she was a ghost. Officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had never existed. The paperwork had been shredded. The records deleted. She'd been told to disappear, and she had, because that's what ghosts do. They vanish. They survive. They wait. Rachel, is it? Caldwell was still talking. His voice had that administrative tone now, the one doctors used when they were setting a precedent. Make sure you're finished with that before the day shift finishes the handoff. We can't have disorganization on my watch. He didn't wait for a response. He moved on to the next victim, some resident who'd misread a blood gas value. Rachel's hands kept working. Her heart rate stayed at 62 beats per minute. The other nurses were already moving away, the moment of entertainment over. She'd survived 17 years of people like Caldwell, men with authority but no real power, men who'd confused fear with respect. She'd survived operations where hesitation meant someone died. She'd carried a 240-pound Army Ranger 3 miles through enemy fire with 2 rounds in her own leg. Caldwell's $50 bet didn't rate. By 10:56 a.m., the ambulance alert came through the overhead system. Highway accident, 2 miles south of the hospital. Unconscious male, estimated age 40 to 50, no identification found at the scene. Vehicle struck a guardrail at speed. The ER staff moved into rhythm, a choreography they'd performed hundreds of times. Beds were cleared. Trauma Bay 1 was activated. Equipment was positioned. Rachel moved with the team, but she wasn't part of the team. She was adjacent to it, helpful but untethered. That's what temp nurses were supposed to be. That's what ghosts were supposed to be. The ambulance bay doors burst open and the paramedics came through fast, their voices clipped and professional. 48-year-old male, head trauma, unconscious on scene, no wallet, no phone, no ID anywhere in the vehicle. BP 128/76 when we picked him up, now 119/72. Responsive to pain only. GCS score is 8, so he's intubated. The stretcher moved like it was on rails, smooth and purposeful. Hit the guardrail at approximately 65 miles per hour. Airbag deployed. Steering wheel crush injury to the chest, but breath sounds are clear bilaterally. Rachel moved toward Trauma Bay 1 with the rest of them, already running calculations in her head, airway secured, breathing adequate, circulation stable but trending low, likely internal bleeding from the crush injury, need imaging immediately. The patient was transferred to the hospital stretcher in a synchronized lift. Rachel was there with the transfer, positioning pillows under the legs for circulation, noting the road rash across the left side of his body, deep abrasions that would need cleaning before they could assess for embedded glass. His left arm was exposed, the skin scraped raw from elbow to wrist. And there, in the midst of the damaged flesh, she saw it. A tattoo. The 75th Ranger Regiment crest, rendered in fading black ink across his exposed bicep. Rachel's breath caught. Just for a half second. Just long enough to register that her hands were moving on muscle memory, checking his pupils, noting the slight asymmetry on the left that suggested possible epidural hematoma, her fingers already assessing for battle sign behind his ears while her mind was somewhere else entirely. Fallujah. 2004, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 18 years. Caldwell was shouting orders. Get him on the monitor. I need a full trauma panel, head CT, chest X-ray, pelvis, and we need it now. Someone get me 2 large bore 4s started immediately. Where's the airway cart? Rachel's hands worked steadily, positioning the patient, checking the endotracheal tube placement, listening for equal breath sounds. The tube had been placed perfectly by the paramedics. No surprises there. The monitors came to life, a symphony of beeping that filled the trauma bay. Heart rate 104. Blood pressure already beginning to drop. Respiratory rate locked at 14 from the ventilator. Oxygen saturation 96%. The patient's belongings, scraped from the vehicle before transport, were being logged by security at the ER desk. Shoes, a torn jacket, the remnants of clothing. No wallet. No phone. Nothing with a name. In the belongings bag, placed carefully in a clear plastic evidence envelope, was a tarnished military challenge coin, the kind that meant something specific to people who knew what to look for. Rachel had one just like it in her pocket. She'd carried it for 18 years. Rachel, draw up 2 units for transfusion. Caldwell's voice cut through the chaos. Rachel moved without hesitation, her hands reaching for the blood bank requisition, her body already in motion. Around her, the ER crystallized into focus. The 4 starts. The imaging requests. The team moving like a single organism. She could do this. She'd done this 1,000 times, though not in a place called St. Michael's. Not wearing scrubs with a temporary agency badge clipped to her collar. Not invisibly, like she was supposed to be. The man on the stretcher had a tattoo that meant he'd been where she'd been. A ranger. Someone who'd trained at Fort Benning, who'd maybe even served in Fallujah during the right window. The timing lined up. Everything lined up. Rachel moved through the trauma bay with competent precision, her movements economical, her voice quiet and clear when she spoke. No one was watching her closely enough to see the way her jaw had tightened just slightly. No one was watching closely enough to see the moment she'd stepped into a different identity entirely, the one she'd buried 18 years ago when the military said disappear. The collision happened in the cafeteria at 11:44 a.m., exactly 3 hours after Caldwell announced his $50 bet to the entire ER staff during morning rounds. Rachel balanced her tray in one hand, the John Doe's chart tucked under her arm, reviewing labs while she walked. She didn't see him step directly into her path. Caldwell moved like a man who expected the world to rearrange itself around his presence, and when Rachel didn't, his coffee exploded across her scrubs in a brown cascade that smelled like bitter almonds and arrogance. The chart scattered. Pages spiraled across the linoleum like wounded birds. Rachel set down her tray with the precision of someone who'd been trained to move deliberately under fire. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's about your speed." The cafeteria went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people eating lunch, but the held breath quiet of an audience waiting to see what happened next. 30 staff members watched from nearby tables, forks suspended, conversations dying mid-sentence. Caldwell stood over her, his white coat immaculate, his expression the kind of smile that wasn't actually a smile at all, it was a predator's teeth. Rachel knelt. The linoleum was cold through her scrubs, damp with spilled coffee, and she gathered every page with methodical precision. Her jaw had tightened imperceptibly. Her pulse hammered in her ears. But her hands remained steady. Surgical steady. The steady of someone who'd practiced maintaining composure while rounds of 7.62 fire stitched patterns in the sand 6 inches from her head. She placed each page in order, vital signs, imaging, labs, her movements economical and professional. No hesitation. No trembling. Her face was a mask of neutral competence, the kind of mask she'd worn for 18 years while pretending to be someone less dangerous than she actually was. "Thanks for the coffee," she said quietly, rising to her feet with the scattered chart against her chest. Her voice was even. Deferential. The voice of a temp nurse who needed this job, who couldn't afford to push back, who understood her place in the hierarchy. She nodded once and walked toward the bathroom to change, leaving Caldwell grinning to his audience like he'd just won something that mattered. The scrubs came off in the employee restroom. Rachel peeled them away, revealing an undershirt that had absorbed some of the spill but remained mostly dry. She scrubbed at the coffee stains with paper towels under water that came out scalding, watching the brown liquid spiral down the drain. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular hospital hum that sat just below conscious awareness, a white noise that never quite let you forget you were somewhere where people died regularly. She looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was pale, controlled, dangerous in the way that quiet people could be. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had survived 17 deployments, had commanded a unit of 240 combat personnel, had carried her own team out of hostile territory when the helicopters couldn't get in. She'd also spent 18 years as someone else, as no one, as invisible. And somewhere in this hospital, lying in a recovery bed with a head injury that had stolen his own memories, was the only person alive who could prove she'd ever actually existed. She changed into her spare scrubs from her locker, always keep a spare, always be ready to move, and returned to the floor. The afternoon shift bloomed around her, stretchers wheeling past with their beeping escorts, the intercom cracking out codes in its perpetual emergency, the smell of antiseptic that never quite covered the copperpenny scent of blood underneath everything. Rachel checked on the John Doe at 2:15 p.m. His monitors showed a heart rate that had crept upward again, 84 beats per minute at 8 a.m., now 97. His blood pressure had drifted down, 128/76 this morning, now 119/71. The pattern didn't match simple head trauma. It looked like something was happening internally, something slow and methodical and wrong. She flagged it to the resident, Dr. Kapoor, who glanced at the monitors with the distracted attention of someone juggling 7 patients simultaneously. "He's stable, Torres. Don't create problems." She wanted to say, "I'm not creating the problem is creating itself in his pericardial sac, which means fluid accumulation, which means the next pressure drop puts him in tamponade, which means he'll die in the next 4 hours if nobody's watching." She wanted to say, "I've seen this before, in field conditions, when soldiers got chest trauma that didn't bleed enough to be obvious but bled just enough to kill them slowly from the inside." She wanted to say, "I am Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres and I have trained for 18 years to recognize exactly this pattern, and if you don't believe me, that's your funeral, not his." Instead, she said, "Understood, Dr. Kapoor. I'll document any changes." She documented everything anyway. A habit from a life where documentation meant the difference between a medal and a court-martial. The habit of someone whose work had to speak for itself because she could never speak for herself. On her break at 4:38 p.m., she returned to the John Doe's bedside when the floor was busy enough that no one monitored the supply room or patient belongings stored in labeled bags. His chart identified him as John Unknown, brought in via ambulance from Route 37 north of the city with significant head trauma and lacerations, no identification found at the scene. His belongings consisted of a wallet containing no ID, a destroyed cell phone, and a single object that had survived the impact intact, a tarnished military challenge coin. She held it under the fluorescent light. The inscription was worn almost smooth by handling, 75th Ranger Regiment, Fallujah 2004. Her unit. Her year. Her operation. When she lifted his arm to check the foreplacement, a legitimate clinical action, one that would draw no attention, she saw the bandage at his inner forearm, and her breath stopped entirely. She peeled back the gauze with the deliberation of someone defusing an explosive device, because that's what this was, a device built to explode her entire carefully constructed life. The tattoo was in military stencil font, black ink slightly faded by 18 years of sun and friction and the simple wear of being alive. The letters formed a single word, Torres. Her name. Permanently inked into his skin. Rachel looked at his face. The scar along his left temple from the head trauma that had erased his memories. The strong jaw that hadn't changed in 18 years. The hands that bore identical calluses to hers, the hands of someone who'd spent their life holding weapons and saving lives and knowing which was which. Sergeant Mills. She'd carried him through 3 miles of hostile territory in Fallujah while the unit extracted 12 hostages from a black site that officially never existed. She'd carried him with his ribs shattered from a blast, with blood soaking through her own uniform until she couldn't tell where his body ended and hers began, with her own ammo depleted and no backup, and the kind of fire discipline that came from understanding this was probably a suicide mission that would only work if she believed hard enough that it wouldn't be. The military had extracted them by helicopter 18 minutes before the compound burned. They'd gotten her medals, quietly, no public record, classified documents that would never see daylight. They'd also gotten her erasure, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, struck from all records, ordered to disappear, told that the operation never happened and therefore neither had she. He'd forgotten. The head injury had stolen that memory completely, the same way the military had stolen her entire identity. But he hadn't forgotten her name. He'd made sure to keep her with him in the only way he could, written into his own skin, where no government redaction could reach it. She replaced the bandage with careful precision and walked away. Her hands were steady. But that night, alone in her apartment on the east side of San Antonio, she held her own tarnished challenge coin, identical to his, bearing the same unit insignia, the same year, and understood that saving him again would either destroy the life she'd built or resurrect the one she'd buried. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing she was going to do it anyway. She monitored his vitals every 2 hours for the next 36 hours, noting each incremental change, each pattern shift that pointed toward a crisis no one else could see coming. Dr. Caldwell continued his campaign, shoulder-checking her away from the crash cart during an afternoon code, calling her sweetie and princess and just a nurse, each insult landing like he expected her to finally break. She showed him nothing. In the supply closet, alone, her hands would shake as she gripped the metal shells and forced Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres back into the temp nurse shell. But the mask was starting to crack. The monitors told a story if you knew how to read them. Rachel stood at Mills's bedside at 2:06 a.m., ostensibly charting his vitals, actually cataloguing the trajectory of his decline. His heart rate had climbed from 78 to 94 to 112 in increments that matched the pattern of internal bleeding she'd seen too many times in forward operating bases. Blood pressure sliding downward in a slow bleed curve. Neck veins slightly distended. The attending radiologist had missed something on the CT scan, she was certain of it. Cardiac tamponade didn't announce itself with drama. It whispered. It crept. And then it killed you in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She'd seen it happen to Lieutenant Commander Graves in Fallujah. A blast that didn't penetrate the ribcage but created enough concussive force to tear vessels inside. The body filled with blood. The heart had nowhere to pump. Graves died on the operating table while a surgeon stared at monitor readings he couldn't interpret fast enough. Rachel had sworn, standing over his body in that field hospital tent with diesel generators humming outside and dust coating everything, that if she ever saw it again, she wouldn't freeze. She wouldn't wait for permission. She wouldn't let institutional hierarchy kill someone because the right doctor wasn't in the room. The night shift at St. Michael's was a skeleton crew. 1 resident, 2 nurses, 1 attending cardiologist in the hospital but 3 units away. Rachel knew the response time. She'd mapped it the same way she'd mapped exits, supply locations, and the fastest routes between trauma and ICU. 13 seconds from the cardiologist's current position. Mills wouldn't have 13 seconds. She pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat where she could watch his face. His skin had taken on a waxy quality. His breathing had become shallower. The ventilator was doing the work, but his own body was shutting down. She knew the moment, could almost see it approaching like headlights through fog. 2, maybe 3 hours. At 3:54 a.m., she left to check the crash cart for the needle kit. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and industrial cleaner. Latex gloves in boxes of 100. Sterile field stacked like paper. She found the pericardiocentesis kit on the 3rd shelf, sealed in its vacuum-packed envelope. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. She held the kit for 30 seconds, feeling its weight, then placed it in her pocket where it pressed against her ribs like a loaded decision. When she returned to the ICU, Mills's monitors had already begun their warning song. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 92, 90. At 0400 hours exactly, the alarm screamed. Not a gentle alert. Not a polite notification. A full code alarm that cut through the hospital's sleeping silence like a chainsaw through bone. Rachel was through the ICU doors before the sound finished its first wail. Her feet moved on instinct, muscle memory from 18 years of combat zones where the fastest response won. The night nurse was already there, calling it in. Code blue, trauma ICU, bed 4. Notify. Rachel didn't hear the rest. She was at Mills's bedside, hands moving to assess him. His blood pressure was 68/44. His heart rate was 142, but the sounds on auscultation were muffled, distant, as if his heart was calling from the bottom of a well. His neck veins distended like cords under taut skin. His lips had taken on a blue-gray pallor. No, she thought. Not here. Not this patient. What's his status? The resident appeared in the doorway, still fastening his lab coat, eyes not yet focused. Cardiac tamponade, Rachel said. Fluid compressing the heart. He's losing perfusion. How long? Minutes. The resident's face went blank. He'd learned this from textbooks and simulation labs. He'd never done it in a real human being with a real heartbeat failing in front of him. Rachel watched him calculate the liability, the protocol violation, the need to call the attending cardiologist and wait for permission while this man's heart was being strangled by its own fluid. Caldwell appeared like a dark thought made physical, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, his authority preceding him like a smell. He took in the monitors in one glance and his hand reached for the crash cart, reaching for the pericardiocentesis kit with the slow deliberation of a man moving through water. His fingers found the vacuum-sealed envelope. He opened it. His hand shook. Rachel watched him. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The procedure he'd done once on a phantom in residency training. The liability if he failed. The protocol that said to wait for cardiothoracic. The patient who had for minutes at absolute maximum before his blood pressure dropped low enough that his brain began dying. We need to call the attending, Caldwell said. His voice sounded like a question. Mills's oxygen sat was at 78. The heart monitor beeped in an arrhythmia that meant the electrical system was shorting out. The room felt like it was tilting, like time was folding in on itself, like she was standing in two moments simultaneously, this ICU and that field hospital tent in Fallujah where graves died while people stared at numbers and waited. Rachel moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't raise her hand or request clearance. She stepped forward and took the kit from Caldwell's trembling hands. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. But he didn't stop her. Maybe he recognized something in her face, the absolute certainty of someone who had already made this choice in a place where making it meant the difference between one person living and one person dying. Torres, stand down. That is an order. She found the anatomical landmarks on Mills's chest by touch alone. Xiphoid process. The angle she needed. 45 degrees. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who had done this under fire while mortars screamed overhead and a man was bleeding out in her arms. The needle went in and she felt the resistance of tissue and then the sudden give as it entered the pericardial sac. Blood and serous fluid rushed into the syringe. Thick, rust-colored evidence of internal catastrophe. Mills gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed. 80, 85. 90, his blood pressure ticked upward. 72/48. 78/52. The heart monitor normalized into something that looked like rhythm. The blue-gray tint began draining from his lips. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. Caldwell stared at her. His face had gone through a transformation that would have been comical if it hadn't been so dangerous: shock, fury, and underneath it all, the recognition that she had just performed a procedure he couldn't under circumstances that would have destroyed his career if the patient died. Which meant she'd also revealed that he froze. That when it mattered, when it was real, he froze. "What the hell did you just do?" he whispered. Rachel met his eyes for exactly 1 second. She let him see something she usually kept buried, not anger, but clarity. The clarity of someone who had held lives together in their hands in places where the only protocols that mattered were the ones written in blood and survival. Then she looked away. "I did what was necessary, doctor." The attending cardiologist arrived at that moment, bursting through the doors with the confidence of someone who was for minutes too late. The resident began briefing him. The night nurse was already pushing medications, checking the 4 lines, stabilizing what Rachel had saved. Caldwell had backed away from the crash cart, his hands at his sides, his expression hardening into something that looked like calculation. Rachel stepped back from Mills's bedside and removed her gloves. She dropped them in the biohazard container with the precision of someone disposing of evidence. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was steady. The part of her that was still Master Chief Petty Officer Torres had already assessed the damage. She'd violated protocol. She'd acted without authorization. She'd shown a superior officer that he wasn't capable in a crisis. She'd embarrassed him in front of a room full of staff. She had also saved a life. And that, she knew with absolute certainty, meant that everything was about to get worse. Caldwell's retaliation began at 7 in the morning, while Rachel was still sitting in the ER break room, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her phone buzzed. A text from the staffing agency: "Need to schedule call with you ASAP." She didn't respond. She already knew what was coming. The first call came at 8:15. Marcus Webb, the hospital board president and Caldwell's golfing buddy, they played 18 holes every Saturday at the country club on the north side, was patched through to the temporary staffing office by Caldwell, who described Rachel's unauthorized invasive procedure with surgical precision. She performed a pericardiocentesis without supervision, Caldwell told Webb, his voice measured and concerned, the tone of a responsible physician protecting the institution. No attending present. No consent obtained from next of kin. The patient is a John Doe from a highway accident, we don't even know his name. She could have killed him. The only reason he survived is luck, not skill. I'm concerned about her qualifications. He didn't mention that she'd saved Mills's life while he stood frozen. He didn't mention that the needle went in at precisely the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with the kind of confidence that only came from someone who'd done it before, many times, in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled ICU. Webb listened. Webb believed. Webb was the kind of administrator who trusted doctors more than he trusted the truth. By 10 o'clock, Caldwell had called the staffing agency directly. This was the turning point, the moment when his retaliation shifted from institutional to personal. "I have significant concerns about Ms. Torres's background," he told the agency director, a woman named Patricia Chen who managed all temporary nursing placements for 5 hospitals across San Antonio. "Gaps in her employment history. Inconsistencies in her resume. I don't feel comfortable having her on our floor without a full credentialing review. For liability reasons." Chen took notes. Chen promised a thorough investigation. Chen had no idea she was being fed lies by someone protecting his own pride. By noon, Caldwell had triggered a formal credentialing investigation. The hospital's compliance officer, a meticulous man named Harold Vickers who'd never denied a doctor's request in his 15 years on the job, opened Rachel's file and immediately flagged the problem everyone could see: there were gaps. 15 years of gaps. Employment history that started abruptly in 2009 with contract work at a private medical clinic in Arlington, nothing before that. No college transcripts on file. No references from previous employers. No explanation for where she'd been between 2004 and 2009. The military erasing you didn't leave a paper trail. The military made you disappear so thoroughly that when you tried to come back, the world had no record you'd ever existed. Vickers sent out the credentialing request at 1,300 hours, full background check, employment verification, certification history, licensure records, references from every position dating back to graduation. He wanted it all within 72 hours. Rachel watched the email arrive in her inbox. She didn't open it. She already knew what it contained, a countdown timer on the last fragment of identity she'd managed to build. At 1,600 hours, she was called to the administrator's office. Not Caldwell, the administrator, Catherine Reeves, a woman in her 50s with grey at her temples and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to know when she was being manipulated but didn't have the authority to refuse a doctor's demand. Catherine gestured for Rachel to sit. Rachel remained standing. "We need to verify your work history, Ms. Torres," Catherine said, and the regret in her voice was genuine, which made it worse. "There are some gaps we can't account for. Dr. Caldwell's raised concerns about the procedure you performed on Sergeant Mills without attending supervision. We need to understand your training, your experience level, who authorized." "I authorized it," Rachel said quietly. Her hands were steady. Her voice was level. The patient was experiencing cardiac tamponade. No attending was available. The patient would have died in approximately 4 minutes if the fluid wasn't evacuated. "I performed the procedure. He survived. That's the full report." "We understand that," Catherine said, and she genuinely did, but it didn't matter. "But we need to verify your credentials. Your certification as a registered nurse. Your previous employment. We can't have gaps. The hospital is liable. We need everything documented." Everything documented meant proving she'd been a human being for the last 15 years, meant producing evidence of a life she'd been ordered to erase, meant explaining why the woman they called Rachel Torres had no history before 2009. It meant opening files that had been sealed by people with authority to keep them sealed. Rachel placed her temporary badge on Catherine's desk. It was laminated plastic the size of a credit card, red with the hospital logo. She'd worn it clipped to her scrubs for 6 days. She'd been invisible in it. She'd counted on staying invisible. "I'm resigning," Rachel said. "We're not asking for your resignation," Catherine replied, but they both knew that was a lie. "We're placing you on suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. Your badge is deactivated as of now. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items from your locker." The locker was in the women's nurses' station, metal and narrow, painted institutional gray. Security walked her there. Rachel opened it. Inside, a spare pair of socks, a protein bar she'd never eaten, a photograph of the 75th Ranger Regiment unit patch that she'd kept hidden behind her name badge. She took the photograph. She left everything else. The security guard, a young man named Derek who'd never spoken to her, handed her a clear plastic bag for her belongings. She put the photograph in her pocket instead. She didn't need the bag. That was how fast you could disappear: 5 days of work, 1 plastic badge, 1 photograph. That was all the evidence she'd left behind. By 1800 hours, the word had spread through St. Michael's that the temp nurse was gone. By 1900 hours, the suspension notice was formal, sent to her apartment address on file. Pending review of credentials. Pending outcome of investigation. No contact with hospital staff. No contact with patients. The language was designed to make her disappear not just from the roster but from the collective memory of the place. In her car in the parking lot, Rachel sat with her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, staring at the concrete barrier in front of her. The sun was dropping behind the buildings, the heat radiating off the asphalt in waves that made the air shimmer. Somewhere inside St. Michael's, Mills was lying in the ICU, recovering from cardiac tamponade that he hadn't even known he had. He was alive because of her. And that was the problem. That act of saving him, muscle memory, instinct, the only thing that mattered in that moment, had revealed her. Not her name. Not her rank. But the depth of her training, the precision of her hands, the absolute certainty of her knowledge. Caldwell had seen it. Caldwell understood what it meant. And Caldwell had known exactly how to weaponize it. She pulled out of the parking lot at 1847 hours. She didn't go home. She drove east, toward the industrial district where the diner was, the one with the neon sign that flickered intermittently and the coffee that tasted like someone had boiled it in an old shoe. She'd been there before, during her first week in San Antonio, when she couldn't sleep and the apartment felt too small. At 0300 hours, Rachel sat in a booth with cracked red vinyl, her coffee cooling in a white ceramic mug. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, one of them flickering every 7 seconds like a clock counting down something no one could stop. The waitress, a woman with purple-dyed hair and the accent of someone who'd been born and raised in Texas, had refilled the cup 3 times. Rachel hadn't taken more than 2 sips. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, overlaid on the parking lot beyond, the image of a woman who was no longer quite real. The temp nurse was gone. Rachel Torres, the registered nurse, had been officially suspended. The Master Chief Petty Officer had never legally existed since 2004. She sat between identities like a bridge someone had burned in the middle of the night. The challenge coin in her pocket felt like an anchor made of lead. She touched it through the fabric of her scrubs, her thumb finding the grooves. It was the only thing that proved she'd ever been who she was. Mills had it tattooed on his skin, or rather, he had her name tattooed, the name that used to mean something in a unit that officially never existed. He'd carried that name through a head injury that had stolen everything else, and now that name was on the evening news, and now the Pentagon was coming. The truck driver in the corner booth finished his pie. The waitress cleared his plate. The door chimed as he left, the cold air from outside rushing in for 1 second before it closed again. Rachel was alone in the diner except for the waitress and the cook she couldn't see, somewhere in the kitchen behind the order window. She wondered if it would be easier to just keep driving. Not north toward the highway, but west, toward the border, toward somewhere that didn't have her face in databases, that didn't have personnel files and credentialing records and challenge coins waiting to be discovered. She could disappear more completely than she'd ever disappeared before. She could become nothing at all. But that wasn't true. That was the lie she'd been telling herself for 15 years. She couldn't disappear. She was tattooed on a man's forearm. She was buried in classified files. She was the person who'd carried an Army Ranger for 3 miles through enemy fire in Fallujah, 2004, and she'd done it because that was who she was, not the person who could choose to vanish, but the person who couldn't leave someone behind. The coffee went cold. The fluorescent light flickered. The clock on the diner wall showed 0341 hours, and Rachel Torres sat in the dark, waiting for everything to change. The broadcast hit the lobby at 0847 hours. A news anchor's voice crackled from the television mounted above the waiting room, low and professional, and Rachel felt the room's atmospheric pressure change. The words came through first: military officials seek information on this decorated combat medic, missing since 2004, and then the photograph filled the screen. Her service photo. Dress whites, hair cut regulation short, the insignia of Master Chief Petty Officer visible on her collar. 23 years old in that image. Unbroken. Unmarked by the things that came after. The caption beneath read, Master Chief Rachel Torres, classified operation, Fallujah, presumed KIA or disappeared under Pentagon orders. The staff members nearest the television froze. One nurse, a woman named Davies who'd watched Caldwell spill coffee on Rachel's scrubs without flinching, turned slowly toward the hallway where Rachel was restocking the trauma bay. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Davies's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came. Around her, 3 residents stopped walking. A custodian with a floor buffer paused mid-stroke, the machine still humming beneath his hands. The lobby didn't go silent, machines continued their mechanical breathing, the ventilation system pushed air through the ductwork, distant sirens wailed somewhere in San Antonio, but something fundamental shifted. The air tasted different. Copper and ozone, like the air before a thunderstorm. Rachel didn't move. She didn't turn. Her hands continued their work, sorting 14-gauge angiocath needles into their precise compartments, muscle memory operating independently of the seismic event occurring 50 feet away. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The same restraint that had kept her breathing steady through 18 years of disappearing, through temp positions and false names and the deliberate erasure of Master Chief Rachel Torres from every official record that mattered. Control was her native language. Mills's room was on the 3rd floor. He'd been awake since 0630, according to his chart, a small miracle, given the cardiac tamponade that nearly killed him 2 days ago, the needle she'd driven between his ribs with the precision of someone who'd done worse things in worse places. When she pushed through his door, he was sitting upright, the bed elevated to 45 degrees, his left hand turning something over repeatedly like a sailor with prayer beads. A tarnished military challenge coin, the kind that carried weight beyond metal. His eyes met hers and his face went pale. Not from pain. From recognition. Phantom, he whispered. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. Eternity compressed into heartbeats. The name hung in the air between them like a blade. Phantom. The call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. The name given to her by rangers who'd watched her move through enemy fire like smoke, like a ghost, like something that couldn't be killed because it didn't technically exist. Mills's hand tightened around the coin. His eyes welled up, not from weakness but from the shock of remembering something the head trauma had stolen from him. Phantom, he said again, this time with absolute certainty. Your Phantom. The door to Mills's room was still open. The hallway beyond was occupied, and it took Rachel exactly 1 second to calculate that the moment of privacy they needed was already collapsing. She was preparing to move, to close the door, to do something to control the cascading exposure when she heard the footsteps. The elderly security guard appeared in the doorway. Samuel Graves, Vietnam veteran, had worked at St. Michael's for 7 years, and Rachel knew from her files that he'd served with the 25th Infantry Division in Binh Duong Province, 1968 to 1970. His eyes had seen things. His hands had held weapons and held dying men, sometimes simultaneously. When he looked from Mills to Rachel to the military challenge coin and back again, his entire body straightened as if someone had run voltage through his spine. He came to attention. Not a casual gesture. A full military stance, shoulders back, spine aligned, the kind of attention that transcended decades and uniform changes and the distance between Vietnam and now. His voice dropped an octave, became something ceremonial and absolute. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck, he said quietly. Not a greeting. A statement of fact. A validation. A resurrection. Davies appeared behind him. Then the charge nurse. Then a resident Rachel recognized from the trauma bay. They lined the hallway, and something extraordinary happened in that space. They stopped looking at her like a temp worker, stopped seeing the invisible woman who'd been moving through St. Michael's like a ghost inside a ghost. They were seeing the uniform she wasn't wearing. They were seeing the rank that didn't appear on any official hospital document. They were seeing Master Chief Rachel Torres with the clarity of people who'd already had the truth broadcast to the entire city. The hospital administrator arrived within minutes. Dr. Victoria Chen, whose MBA had come from Yale and whose administrative instincts ran toward competent pragmatism rather than institutional cowardice. She was holding a folder that looked official enough to change lives. She was holding a file with Pentagon classified stamped across the cover in fading red ink. "Master Chief Torres," she said, her voice steady, "I apologize for the circumstances of this revelation. The Pentagon contacted me 20 minutes ago. They're acknowledging the Fallujah operation. They're acknowledging you." Chen opened the file. The air in the room seemed to compress. Navy Commendation. Silver Star. She paused, letting that land. Another silver star. Another pause. And a third silver star. Her eyes flicked up from the document. And a Navy Cross. The medals were listed like individual deaths, each one its own sentence. Each one a moment where Rachel had done something the military simultaneously couldn't acknowledge and couldn't possibly ignore. The citation states that you initiated and led a tactical extraction that resulted in the recovery of 12 soldiers from an active fire zone in Fallujah, Jolan district. 12 men who would have died without your intervention. The operation is now declassified, effective immediately. Mills lifted his left sleeve. The tattoo covered the inside of his forearm, written in careful block letters that must have taken hours. Rachel Torres. Underneath, in smaller script, Phantom. His voice came out rough, broken by something deeper than emotion. 3 miles, he said. You carried me 3 miles through Fallujah with a sucking chest wound and an infection that nearly killed you. I marked myself. Consciously, deliberately, when my head was clear enough to remember what happened. I wanted to remember you. Even if the trauma tried to steal it, I wanted something permanent. He looked at her directly. You're on my skin. You're in my body. You're proof that you existed, that you saved me, that you mattered. Rachel's jaw tightened. This was the moment where the composure worked its strange alchemy, the training that taught her to absorb shock without showing it, to process revelation without displaying anything on her face, to exist in public with the precision of a surgical laser. She nodded once. That single gesture contained 15 years of silence. What happened next came in the form of movement and authority. The FBI arrived at 1,100 hours exactly. Not for Rachel. The 2 agents, one tall with shoulders like a water buffalo, one with the face of someone who'd already heard every lie a human could produce, walked past her in the hallway with professional nods and entered the administrative wing. They found Dr. Caldwell in his office attempting to reorganize files, attempting to look professional, attempting to project the kind of competence that vanishes the moment you start committing federal crimes. Rachel watched from the second-floor window as they approached him. Watched his face drain of all color. Watched him stand, attempt to explain, attempt to invoke his network, Marcus Webb, the board president, his golf buddy of 17 years. The network evaporated like water on hot asphalt. Webb released a statement within the hour condemning Caldwell's unethical conduct, praising the hospital's commitment to integrity, and vanishing into the corporate silence of someone protecting institutional liability. The residents who'd laughed at Caldwell's jokes about the temp nurse suddenly didn't return his pages. The attending physicians who'd watched him humiliate Rachel stopped making eye contact. By 14:30 hours, Caldwell was being escorted toward the main entrance in handcuffs, the same path Rachel had walked when she'd been suspended, the same lobby where his coffee had splashed across her scrubs. The perp walk was silent except for camera shutters. Local news. Security footage. the photographer from the San Antonio Express-News capturing the image of Dr. Devon Caldwell, credential forger, fabricator of performance reviews, federal fraud perpetrator, being led toward a police unit by agents who discovered 6 years of falsified evaluations covering up patient complaints that should have cost him his license 5 years prior. His medical license was suspended immediately. Permanently within the week. The criminal prosecution would proceed. Within 6 months, the hospital grapevine would deliver the information that Caldwell was teaching CPR at a community college for minimum wage, living in a studio apartment, his marriage in ruins, his career obliterated by the very fabrications he'd constructed to destroy Rachel. She would feel nothing about this. Master Chief Torres learned long ago that revenge was just gravity. What goes up always comes down. Mills's final evening at St. Michael's arrived with the kind of quietness that only hospitals can produce, machines breathing in their mechanical rhythms, footsteps muffled by linoleum, the world outside reduced to distant sounds. He was being transferred to a VA facility in the morning, somewhere that could provide the long-term cardiac rehabilitation a ranger's body required after the trauma of tamponade and emergency intervention. Rachel stood in his room holding the challenge coin she'd pressed into his palm in Fallujah 15 years ago, the same coin he'd kept through 18 years of military service, the same coin that had survived the head trauma that nearly killed everything else. "I'm sorry I forgot you," Mills said. Not with apology. With the weight of someone who understood that forgetting was a mercy his body had granted him, and also a kind of betrayal. Rachel sat in the chair beside his bed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to exist as something other than a ghost. "You didn't forget," she said, gesturing to the tattoo on his forearm. The letters of her name written permanently into his skin. "You just couldn't remember." "That's different." He reached for her hand, and the challenge coin pressed between their palms like a prayer. "What happens to you now?" he asked. The Pentagon had offered restoration. Complete acknowledgement. Her records unsealed, her identity returned, the whole machinery of military bureaucracy grinding in reverse to return what it had taken from her. St. Michael's had offered her a permanent position, not as a temp, but as trauma coordinator, with full authority and her real name on official documents. 18 years of temp positions and false names and careful movement through the gaps between official existence. 18 years of being Rachel Torres only in the spaces where nobody was watching. She looked at her reflection in the dark hospital window. This time, she didn't see emptiness. She saw Master Chief Rachel Torres. She saw Rachel. She saw both people at once, integrated, whole, existing in the same skin. "I think I'll stay," she said. "I think I'm tired of disappearing." The hallway outside Mills's room stretched like a gauntlet, and Rachel walked through it knowing that the staff who'd watched Caldwell humiliate her were now offering different things. Respect. Or apology written across their faces. The elderly security guard, Samuel Graves, stood at attention as she passed. She didn't salute back, she was in civilian clothes, trauma coordinator credentials already being processed, but she met his eyes and nodded, and that gesture contained the weight of an entire military career compressed into a single moment of recognition. 6 months later, a framed photograph appeared in the hospital's main corridor. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres receiving the Navy Cross in a delayed ceremony, the kind that had to happen somewhere quiet, somewhere official, somewhere that acknowledged what Fallujah had demanded. She was flanked by the 12 Rangers she'd pulled from enemy fire. Sergeant Mills stood front and center, his left sleeve rolled up to display the tattoo. Below the image, a plaque in brushed bronze read, "The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together." Rachel Torres walked past that photograph every morning when she came to work. Some days she paused. Most days she didn't. The work of being alive, of existing openly, of carrying a name that belonged to her, that was enough. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.